The rain hammered against the windows of Murphy's bar like bullets hitting armor. Inside, the warm glow of amber lights created a cozy atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the storm outside. Sarah Martinez sat at the far end of the bar, nursing a whiskey neat while watching the news on the mounted television. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore civilian clothes, jeans, and a black sweater that did nothing to reveal the incredible physical conditioning beneath. To anyone looking, she appeared to be just another patron seeking shelter from the storm. But Sarah Martinez was anything but ordinary. For the past 8 years, she had served as one of the most elite warriors in the United States Navy. Her official designation was Petty Officer First Class Martinez, but in the special operations community, she was known by a different name entirely. One that carried weight in the darkest corners of the world where America's most dangerous enemies lurked. The bar was moderately busy for a Tuesday evening. A group of construction workers occupied a table near the dartboard, their voices rising and falling with each throw. 2 older men sat at the bar discussing politics with the passion of people who believed they could solve the world's problems over a few beers. A young couple shared a booth in the corner, lost in each other's company and oblivious to the world around them. Sarah had chosen this particular establishment precisely because it was unremarkable. After spending months in places where every shadow could hide an enemy and every sound might herald incoming fire, she found comfort in the mundane predictability of civilian life. The greatest threat here was someone having too much to drink and saying something stupid. She took another sip of her whiskey, savoring the burn as it went down. Tomorrow, she would report back to base after a well-deserved 2-week leave. 2 weeks of sleeping without keeping one eye open, of walking down streets without constantly scanning for threats, of being nobody special in a world where being special often meant being a target. The door chimed as it opened, and a gust of cold air swept through the bar. Sarah glanced up from her drink to see a group of 5 men entering, shaking rain from their jackets and talking loudly among themselves. They looked like military, something in their bearing, their haircuts, their way of scanning the room as they entered. Not special operations, she could tell immediately. Regular Navy, maybe Marines on shore leave. They chose a table near the center of the room, close enough to the bar that their conversation would carry. As they settled in and ordered their first round, Sarah couldn't help but overhear their discussion. They were indeed military sailors from the USS Constitution, a guided missile destroyer currently docked for maintenance. They talked with the easy camaraderie of men who had served together, sharing stories of ports visited and liberty taken. I'm telling you, one of them was saying, a tall blonde man with the bearing of a petty officer. SEALs aren't that special. Half of what you hear about them is just propaganda. His comment drew immediate protest from his companions. Sarah smiled to herself and took another drink. If only they knew that one of the people they were discussing was sitting 20 feet away. Come on, Peterson, another sailor replied. You can't seriously believe that. These guys go through hell to earn their tridents. And the things they do in the field. Exaggerated, Peterson insisted. I bet half of them couldn't handle real Navy life on a ship, too used to all their special equipment and support. Sarah found herself oddly entertained by the debate. She had heard similar discussions countless times over the years, usually from people who had never experienced combat beyond what they saw in movies. Peterson seemed to be one of those individuals who believed that loudness and confidence could substitute for actual knowledge. The conversation continued for another half hour, with Peterson becoming increasingly vocal in his opinions about special operations forces. His companions seemed less convinced by his arguments, but they didn't challenge him directly. Military hierarchy and courtesy kept them from being too confrontational, even during off-duty hours. The thing is, Peterson continued, his voice carrying clearly across the bar, these special ops people think they're better than the rest of us. They get all this attention, all this credit, when the real Navy does the actual work of keeping the seas safe. Sarah finished her whiskey and signaled the bartender for another. She had no intention of engaging with these men, but Their conversation was certainly more interesting than the weather report droning on the television. The bartender, a middle-aged man with graying hair and gentle eyes, poured her drink with practiced efficiency. "Interesting discussion over there," he commented quietly. "Everyone's an expert," Sarah replied with a slight smile. "You military?" he asked, his voice low enough that the conversation stayed between them. Sarah answered, which was technically true since she was currently on leave. The bartender nodded knowingly. "I was Army, back in the day. Desert Storm. Nothing like what these kids today are dealing with, but enough to know that the people who talk the most usually know the least." Sarah raised her glass in a small toast. Amen to that. As the evening progressed, Peterson's commentary became more pronounced. He had consumed several beers by this point, and his inhibitions were clearly diminished. His stories grew more elaborate, his opinions more definitive, and his voice louder. "I mean, take Navy SEALs," he declared, his words beginning to slur slightly. "Everyone acts like they're these superhuman warriors. But at the end of the day, they're just soldiers with better PR. I guarantee you that most of them would wash out of regular Navy training if they had to do real sailor work." One of his companions, a young man who looked barely old enough to drink, shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know, Peterson. My brother's a Marine, and he says the special operations guys he's worked with were pretty impressive." "Marines," Peterson scoffed. "Another bunch of prima donnas who think they're special because they went through boot camp on an island. Real sailors learn their trade on the open ocean, dealing with actual challenges." Sarah found herself studying Peterson more carefully. He was clearly intelligent enough to have earned his rate in the Navy, but his arrogance was astounding. She wondered what his shipmates really thought of him, whether they were nodding along out of politeness or genuine agreement. The young sailor who had mentioned his Marine brother tried again. "But don't you think the training they go through has to count for something? I heard SEAL training has like a 90% washout rate." "Training," Peterson laughed. "You know what real training is? Spending 6 months at sea in rough weather, keeping a billion-dollar warship operational with limited resources and no backup. That's training. Running around in the woods, playing war games is just expensive camping." Sarah caught the bartender's eye and saw him shake his head slightly. Clearly, Peterson wasn't winning any friends with his commentary. Even his own companions were looking less enthusiastic about his opinions as the evening wore on. The rain outside had intensified, drumming against the windows with increased fury. The storm showed no signs of letting up, which meant everyone in the bar was likely to be there for a while longer. Sarah considered settling her tab and calling a taxi, but something about the situation held her attention. Maybe it was professional curiosity about how Peterson's theories would evolve as he continued drinking. Maybe it was simple entertainment value, watching someone dig themselves deeper into a hole they didn't even realize they were in. Or maybe it was something else entirely, a growing irritation with his dismissive attitude toward people who had sacrificed everything in service to their country. Peterson was now regaling his audience with a story about a training exercise where his ship had supposedly outperformed a special operations unit in some unspecified competition. The details were vague, the timeline inconsistent, and the claims increasingly implausible. His companions listened with the patience of people who had heard similar stories before and knew better than to challenge them directly. "The thing about these special ops people," Peterson continued, his voice now loud enough that most of the bar could hear him, "is that they rely too much on mystique. All this secrecy and we can't talk about what we do nonsense. If they were really as good as they claim, they wouldn't need all the smoke and mirrors." The young sailor tried once more. "But the secrecy is for operational security, right? They can't talk about missions because it might compromise ongoing operations or put people at risk." Peterson waved dismissively. "That's what they want you to think. Trust me, if I had done half the things they claim to do, I wouldn't be shy about sharing the details. Real heroes don't hide behind classified stamps." Sarah felt her jaw tighten slightly. She knew dozens of operators who carried scars, both physical and psychological, from missions they could never discuss. Men and Women who had made incredible sacrifices in places whose names would never appear in newspapers, against enemies the public would never know existed. The idea that their discretion was somehow evidence of deception rather than professionalism was deeply offensive. But she remained silent, continuing to nurse her whiskey and observe the conversation. This was their liberty time, and they had every right to express their opinions, however misguided those opinions might be. She was not their commanding officer or their instructor. She was just another patron trying to enjoy a quiet drink. The television above the bar switched from weather to a news report about recent military operations in an unnamed location. The footage showed aerial shots of a compound and brief interviews with Pentagon officials discussing the successful completion of a high-value target mission. No details were provided beyond the basic fact that American Special Operations Forces had conducted the operation with no casualties. Peterson glanced at the screen and snorted. See what I mean? Unnamed location, high-value target, no details available for operational security. It's all theater. Real military operations don't need this kind of dramatic presentation. His youngest companion pointed at the screen. But they got the bad guy, right? Isn't that what matters? Did they? Peterson challenged. How do we know? Because they told us so? For all we know, this whole thing was staged to justify their budgets. These special operations units cost millions to maintain. They need to show results to keep the money flowing. Sarah's hand tightened almost imperceptibly around her glass. She knew exactly what operation was being discussed on the news, though she couldn't say so. She had been part of the planning team that had spent months developing the intelligence picture that made the mission possible. She knew the target, knew what he had been planning, knew how many lives had been saved by removing him from the battlefield. But she also knew that Peterson would never believe any of that, even if she could somehow prove it to him. His worldview was constructed in such a way that evidence contradicting his opinions would simply be dismissed as part of the conspiracy he imagined. The news report ended, and the television returned to its regular programming. The bar settled back into its normal rhythm of quiet conversation and clinking glasses. Peterson's group continued their discussion, though his companions seemed less engaged than before. They had clearly heard enough of his theories for one evening. Sarah finished her second whiskey and considered her options. The storm outside showed no signs of abating, and she was in no hurry to get back to her hotel room. Her leave was almost over, and soon she would return to a world where every decision could mean the difference between life and death, where quiet evenings in civilian bars would be nothing but a distant memory. She decided to order one more drink and see how the evening played out. Sometimes the most interesting stories came from the most unexpected places, and Peterson's commentary was certainly unexpected, if not necessarily interesting in the way he intended. The bartender refilled her glass without being asked, a courtesy she appreciated. "Looks like we're all stuck here for a while," he commented, gesturing toward the storm-darkened windows. "Could be worse," Sarah replied. "At least it's warm and dry. And entertaining," he added with a slight smile, glancing toward Peterson's table. Sarah raised her glass again. "Entertainment is where you find it." As the evening progressed, she continued to observe and listen, waiting to see what would happen next in this small drama playing out in an unremarkable bar on a stormy Tuesday night. She had no idea that before the evening was over, Peterson would learn exactly how wrong his assumptions could be, or that her carefully maintained anonymity was about to become the most interesting thing that had happened in Murphy's Bar in years. The atmosphere in Murphy's Bar had gradually shifted as Peterson's commentary grew more pointed and his voice louder. What had started as casual military shop talk among friends had evolved into something resembling a one-man lecture on the failings of America's special operations community. His companions looked increasingly uncomfortable, occasionally glancing around the bar to see if other patrons were listening to their conversation. Sarah noticed a change in dynamics immediately. The young sailor who had tried to defend Special Operations Forces had given up his arguments and was now focusing intently on his beer bottle label. The others were checking their phones, looking at their watches, and generally displaying the universal body language of people who wanted to be somewhere else. But Peterson was oblivious to their discomfort, fueled by alcohol and the sound of his own voice. He had moved on from general criticisms to specific claims about various special operations units, each story more elaborate than the last. I remember when we were in port in Norfolk, he was saying, his words slightly slurred but his confidence undiminished. There was this SEAL who came aboard for some joint training exercise. Guy was supposed to be some hotshot operator, but he couldn't even figure out our navigation systems. Had to have one of our junior petty officers walk him through basic procedures. The story was almost certainly fictional, Sarah knew. SEALs received extensive cross-training on Navy systems as part of their preparation for maritime operations. But Peterson's audience wasn't in a position to challenge his claims, and he seemed to interpret their silence as agreement. That's the thing about these special operations people, Peterson continued, warming to his theme. They're specialists, not real military professionals. Put them outside their narrow area of expertise, and they're helpless. A real sailor can adapt to any situation. Sarah took a slow sip of her whiskey, wondering how Peterson would react if he knew he was sitting 20 feet away from someone who had successfully operated in environments ranging from Arctic conditions to tropical jungles, from urban combat zones to open ocean operations. Her training had included everything from advanced maritime navigation to explosive ordnance disposal, from foreign language proficiency to advanced medical procedures. But more than the technical skills, she thought about the mental conditioning required for special operations work. The ability to remain calm under extreme pressure, to make life or death decisions with incomplete information, to function effectively while exhausted, injured, or outnumbered. These weren't skills that could be measured in a bar conversation or demonstrated through stories. The door chimed again as another group entered, this time 3 women in their 30s who looked like they were having a girls' night out. They claimed a table near the window, laughing and talking animatedly as they shook off the rain and ordered their first round. Their energy was infectious, and several other patrons glanced over with smiles. Peterson's group also noticed the newcomers, and their conversation temporarily shifted to more typical shore leave topics. But after a few minutes of relatively normal discussion about weekend plans and upcoming liberty, Peterson returned to his favorite subject. "You know what really gets me," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the bar again, "is how these special operations units get all the credit for things that regular military forces actually accomplish. Like that operation in the news tonight. They're calling it a special ops mission, but I guarantee you it was supported by regular Navy ships, regular Air Force planes, regular Army logistics. But do they get mentioned? Of course not." One of his companions, a stocky man with a Boston accent, finally spoke up. "Come on, Peterson. You don't really know what happened on that mission. None of us do." "That's my point exactly," Peterson replied triumphantly. "It's all classified, all secret, all mysterious. Real military operations have clear command structures and documented procedures. This cloak and dagger stuff is just Hollywood nonsense." Sarah found herself studying Peterson's face as he spoke. There was something beyond simple ignorance driving his commentary. She had encountered this attitude before, a kind of resentment towards special operations forces that stemmed from feeling overlooked or undervalued. Peterson clearly took pride in his service aboard surface ships, and he seemed to view the attention given to special operations as somehow diminishing his own contributions. It wasn't an uncommon feeling. The regular military services did indeed provide the backbone of America's defense capabilities, often with less recognition than they deserved. But Peterson's response to that situation was to tear down others rather than advocate for proper recognition of his own community's contributions. The bartender had been listening to the conversation as well, and Sarah noticed him shaking his head slightly as he cleaned glasses. As a former Army soldier, he had probably encountered similar attitudes during his own service. The military was generally good at fostering unit pride and esprit de corps, but sometimes that pride manifested as rivalry or dismissiveness toward other units. "Tell you what," Peterson announced suddenly, his voice rising above the general bar noise. I bet there isn't a single person in this bar who's actually served with real special operations forces. It's all just movies and media hype. These people don't actually exist in the numbers everyone thinks they do. The challenge hung in the air for a moment. Several patrons glanced around, but no one immediately responded. Sarah considered whether to say something, but decided to remain silent. Her presence here was coincidental, and she had no obligation to educate Peterson about realities he clearly wasn't interested in learning. See, Peterson said, interpreting the silence as confirmation of his theory. All this talk about elite warriors and secret missions, but when it comes to actual people who've worked with them, nothing. It's all mythology. The young sailor at Peterson's table looked uncomfortable. Maybe people just don't talk about it. I mean, if someone had worked with special operations, they might not feel comfortable discussing it in a public place. Peterson laughed loudly, right? Because everything is so secret and classified. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Real military professionals don't hide behind secrecy. They're proud of their service and willing to discuss their experiences. Sarah felt a flash of genuine anger at that comment. She thought about friends who had died on missions they could never discuss, whose families received only vague explanations about training accidents or equipment failures. She thought about operators who had sacrificed years of their lives in places the American public would never hear about, fighting enemies whose very existence remained classified. The idea that discretion about such matters was somehow evidence of deception rather than professionalism was not just wrong. It was insulting to every person who had ever placed their nation's security above their personal desire for recognition. But she also recognized that arguing with Peterson would accomplish nothing. He had constructed his worldview to be immune to contrary evidence. Any claims about special operations capabilities would be dismissed as propaganda. Any evidence of their effectiveness would be attributed to regular military support. Any discussion of classified operations would be seen as proof of unnecessary secrecy. Instead, she signaled the bartender for another drink and continued to observe. Sometimes the best way to understand people was to let them talk without interruption. Peterson was certainly providing plenty of material for analysis. I'll tell you something else, Peterson continued, emboldened by what he perceived as his audience's agreement. These special operations people aren't even that physically impressive. I've seen some of them, and they look like regular people. Where are all these super soldiers we keep hearing about? The comment drew a snort of laughter from the bartender, who had been listening while he worked. Peterson noticed the reaction and turned toward the bar with a challenging expression. "You got something to say?" Peterson asked, his tone becoming slightly aggressive. The bartender looked up from the glass he was drying. "Just thinking about some folks I knew in the Army. The most dangerous guys I served with usually looked like accountants or teachers. The ones who looked like movie stars were usually all show and no substance." Peterson's expression darkened. "You calling me all show? I'm not calling you anything," the bartender replied calmly. "Just sharing an observation about appearances being deceiving." The tension in the bar increased noticeably. Several conversations stopped as patrons sensed the potential for confrontation. Sarah turned slightly on her stool to get a better view of the situation, her body automatically shifting into a more ready position. Peterson stood up from his table, swaying slightly as the alcohol affected his balance. His companions immediately tried to calm him down, but he waved off their efforts. "Maybe you military folks are all used to backing down from confrontation," Peterson said, his voice now loud enough that everyone in the bar could hear him clearly. "But some of us actually stand up for ourselves." The bartender set down his towel and looked directly at Peterson. "Son, I'm not looking for any trouble. This is a friendly establishment, and I'd like to keep it that way. Why don't you sit back down and enjoy your drinks?" "Don't call me son," Peterson snapped. "I'm a United States Navy petty officer, and I deserve respect." "You'll get all the respect you earn," the bartender replied quietly. The exchange was escalating quickly toward something ugly. Sarah could see Peterson's companions trying to intervene, but their efforts were only making him more defensive. The other patrons were watching nervously, unsure whether to leave or stay to see what would happen. This was the moment when Sarah had to make a decision. She could continue to remain anonymous, letting the situation play out without her involvement. Peterson would probably make more of a fool of himself, possibly get thrown out of the bar, and learn nothing from the experience. His friends would be embarrassed, the other patrons would have their evening disrupted, and the bartender would have to deal with an unpleasant confrontation. Or she could intervene, though any intervention would require revealing at least some information about herself. Once she stepped into the situation, her carefully maintained anonymity would be gone. Peterson took a step toward the bar, his hands clenched into fists. "You think you're better than me because you serve in some army unit? Let me tell you something about real military service." That decided it for Sarah. She had listened to enough of Peterson's theories about military service, and she wasn't going to sit quietly while he threatened a veteran who was just trying to do his job. She turned fully on her stool to face Peterson, her movements smooth and deliberate. "Actually," she said, her voice cutting clearly through the bar noise, "I'd be interested in hearing more about your theories on special operations forces." Peterson turned toward her, his aggression momentarily deflected by the unexpected intervention. "What? You've been talking about special operations for the past hour," Sarah said calmly. "You seem to have some very specific ideas about their capabilities and training. I'm curious about the basis for those opinions." Peterson looked her up and down, clearly trying to assess this new participant in the conversation. "And you are?" "Someone who's been listening," Sarah replied. "You said earlier that there's probably nobody in this bar who's actually worked with special operations forces. You suggested that people who claim such experience are just repeating media hype." "That's right," Peterson said, his confidence returning. "It's all mythology and propaganda." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Interesting theory. What would it take to convince you otherwise?" The question caught Peterson off guard. He had been prepared for either agreement or challenge, but not for Socratic dialogue. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what kind of evidence would you accept that special operations forces are real, that they do the things they're credited with, and that they deserve the recognition they receive?" Peterson's companions were watching the exchange with interest, clearly relieved that the focus had shifted away from confrontation with the bartender. The other patrons were also paying attention, sensing that something significant was happening. "Evidence," Peterson repeated. "Real evidence? Not stories, not classified mission reports, not secondhand accounts. Real, verifiable evidence." Sarah smiled slightly. "That's a reasonable standard. But it creates an interesting logical problem, doesn't it?" "What kind of problem?" "Well, you've defined real evidence as anything that isn't classified or secondhand. But by definition, most special operations work is classified, and the people who do it aren't supposed to talk about it in detail. So you've created a standard of evidence that makes it impossible for anyone to prove you wrong." Peterson frowned, sensing that he was being outmaneuvered, but not sure how. "That's not. I mean, if these operations are really happening, there should be some way to verify them." "There is," Sarah said. "Congressional oversight committees review classified operations. Military historians document them after declassification. Foreign intelligence services confirm them through their own sources. The evidence exists. It's just not available for casual conversation in a bar." "But that's exactly my point," Peterson said, his voice rising again. "Everything is classified. Everything is secret. Everything is off limits to verification. How is that different from saying it's all made up?" Sarah considered the question seriously. "I suppose it comes down to trust. Do you trust the institutions that oversee these operations? Do you trust the people who serve in them? Do you trust the democratic processes that authorize and review them?" "I trust what I can see and verify for myself," Peterson replied. "That's fair," Sarah acknowledged. "But it also means you're limiting your understanding of the world to only those things that happen within your direct observation. That's a pretty narrow window." The conversation was drawing more attention now. Other patrons had turned to listen, and even Peterson's companions seemed interested in seeing where this intellectual sparring match would lead. Peterson sensed that he was losing control of the narrative. "Look, I don't know who you are or what your agenda is, but I stand by what I said. These so-called elite operators are mostly hype, and anyone who says otherwise is either naive or part of the propaganda machine. Sarah nodded slowly. Okay, I understand your position, but I'm curious about something else you said earlier. What? You mentioned that real military professionals don't hide behind secrecy, that they're proud of their service and willing to discuss their experiences. That's right. So if someone in this bar had actually worked with special operations forces, they should be willing to talk about it openly. Peterson's eyes narrowed. Are you saying you have? Sarah paused, considering her next words carefully. Once she answered, there would be no going back to anonymity. But Peterson's attitude toward military service, his dismissal of sacrifice and professionalism, and his willingness to threaten a veteran who was simply doing his job had pushed her past the point where she was willing to remain silent. I'm saying, she replied slowly, that your assumptions about who might be in this bar tonight could be wrong. The statement hung in the air like a challenge, and Peterson realized that the conversation had taken a turn he hadn't anticipated. The woman sitting at the bar looked ordinary enough, but there was something in her eyes, something in the way she carried herself, that suggested she was more than she appeared to be. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice suddenly much more cautious. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, then glanced around the bar at the faces watching their exchange. The bartender was paying close attention, his earlier concern replaced by curiosity. Peterson's companions were leaning forward, sensing that they were about to learn something significant. Even the other patrons had stopped their own conversations to listen. "Most people," she said finally, "call me Shadow 6. The silence that followed Sarah's revelation was profound and immediate. Every conversation in Murphy's bar stopped. The sound of rain against the windows seemed amplified in the sudden quiet, and even the background music from the jukebox couldn't mask the tension that had settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Peterson stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, as if he had been preparing to deliver another lecture, but the words had simply vanished. His companions stared at the woman sitting calmly at the bar, trying to process what they had just heard. The name Shadow 6 clearly meant something to them, though their exact knowledge was limited. In military circles, certain call signs carried weight beyond their operational purpose. They became legends, stories passed down through formal briefings and informal conversations. Shadow 6 was one of those names, whispered in special operations communities, mentioned in classified after-action reports, and known to anyone who paid attention to the more secretive aspects of America's military capabilities. Sarah took a sip of her whiskey, seemingly unaffected by the stares directed her way. She had known this moment would come eventually, though she hadn't planned for it to happen in a civilian bar during her leave time. But Peterson's attitudes had pushed her past the point where she could remain silent, and now she would have to deal with the consequences. The bartender was the first to break the silence. "Shadow 6, he repeated quietly, recognition dawning in his eyes. "I'll be damned." Peterson found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak than his usual confident tone. That's not possible." Sarah turned to look at him directly. "Which part isn't possible? That someone with special operations experience would be in this bar tonight? Or that they might look like a regular person having a quiet drink? But Peterson struggled to find words that wouldn't sound offensive. "I mean, you don't look like..." "Like what?" Sarah asked, her tone remaining calm, but with an edge that suggested Peterson should choose his next words carefully. "Like a warrior," Peterson finished weakly. Sarah almost smiled at that. "And what exactly does a warrior look like? 6 feet tall? Muscles bulging out of their shirt? Scars across their face? Maybe a permanent scowl? And a tendency to solve all problems with violence?" Peterson's companions were watching the exchange with fascination and growing embarrassment. They could see their friend digging himself into an ever deeper hole, but they seemed unsure whether to intervene or simply let the situation play out. The stories about Shadow 6. Peterson began, then stopped himself. "What stories?" Sarah asked. "I'm curious what version of events has made it into general circulation." Peterson looked around the bar, suddenly aware that he had become the center of attention. The alcohol that had given him confidence earlier was now making him feel exposed and vulnerable. I heard about operations in Afghanistan. Some kind of hostage rescue that went wrong, then went right because of one operator who he trailed off, realizing that he didn't actually know the details of what he was trying to describe. Go on, Sarah encouraged. You were saying something about an operation that went wrong. I don't actually know the specifics, Peterson admitted. It's all classified, like you said. But you were willing to dismiss it as mythology a few minutes ago, Sarah pointed out. Which is it? A real operation that you've heard about, or propaganda that doesn't deserve serious consideration? The logical trap was obvious to everyone in the bar except Peterson himself. He had been caught using the existence of stories about special operations as evidence that such operations were fictional, while simultaneously acknowledging that he had heard specific stories about the person sitting in front of him. One of Peterson's companions, the young sailor who had earlier defended Marines based on his brother's experience, leaned forward with obvious interest. Are you really Shadow 6? I mean, the actual person? Sarah considered how to answer. The call sign was real, as was her identity as a Navy SEAL with an extensive operational history. But the stories that circulated about her exploits were often embellished or distorted through multiple retellings. Separating fact from fiction would require discussing classified operations, which she couldn't and wouldn't do. The call sign is mine, she said simply. As for the stories, some are more accurate than others. The young sailor's eyes widened. This is incredible. I mean, you're like a legend. The guys on my ship talk about some of the things Shadow 6 has supposedly done. Supposedly? Sarah repeated, raising an eyebrow. The young man blushed. I mean, the things you've actually done. Sir, Mom, I'm not sure what the proper address is for. Sarah is fine, she said with a slight smile. We're all civilians in here tonight. Peterson had been listening to this exchange with growing agitation. His worldview was crumbling in real time, and he was struggling to maintain any semblance of his earlier confidence. This is impossible, he said, his voice louder than necessary. Shadow 6 is supposed to be some kind of superhuman operator. You can't be. I mean, you look like someone's sister, or a teacher, or a person, Sarah finished for him. Which is exactly what special operations personnel are, people who have received extensive training and have chosen to serve in dangerous situations. We're not comic book characters or movie heroes. We're professionals doing a difficult job. The bartender had been listening intently, and now he spoke up. Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, what unit did you serve with? DevGru, Sarah replied, using the official designation for SEAL Team 6. Though most people know it by its old name. The room fell silent again. Even among Navy SEALs, DevGru was considered the elite of the elite. The unit's existence was officially acknowledged, but its operations remained highly classified. Peterson's claim that special operations forces were mythological was becoming more absurd by the minute. Peterson himself seemed to deflate as the implications sank in. He had spent the entire evening lecturing about the fictional nature of America's most elite military units to someone who had actually served with the most elite unit of all. I don't understand, he said quietly. If you're really who you say you are, why didn't you say something earlier? Why don't we go on like that? Sarah considered the question seriously. Because you have every right to your opinions, even if I disagree with them. Because correcting every misconception about special operations isn't my responsibility. And because sometimes it's more educational to listen than to talk. She paused, then added, also because I hope you might eventually realize that your assumptions were flawed without needing to be corrected by someone else. Peterson's face reddened. You are making fun of me, letting me embarrass myself for your entertainment. Not at all, Sarah replied firmly. I was listening to your perspective and trying to understand the reasoning behind it. Your opinions aren't inherently funny. They're just based on incomplete information. The young sailor spoke up again. Could you tell us about some of your operations? I mean, anything that's not classified? Sarah shook her head. Almost everything I did is classified and will remain so for many years. That's not because it's mythological or fictional. It's because discussing the details could compromise ongoing operations, reveal intelligent sources and methods, or put other operators at risk. But that's exactly what Peterson was saying, one of his companions pointed out, that the secrecy makes it impossible to verify anything. That's true, Sarah acknowledged. But Peterson's conclusion was that unverifiable claims must be false. The alternative conclusion is that some things are unverifiable for legitimate reasons, and you have to decide whether to trust the institutions and people involved. She looked directly at Peterson. You chose not to trust them. That's your right as an American citizen. But your distrust doesn't make their service less real or their sacrifices less meaningful. Peterson was struggling with the cognitive dissonance of having his fundamental assumptions challenged by someone who represented everything he claimed didn't exist. But how am I supposed to know what to believe? If everything is classified and secret, how can anyone tell the difference between real operations and made-up stories? It was actually a reasonable question, Sarah realized. Peterson's skepticism, while misguided in its conclusions, arose from a legitimate concern about accountability and transparency in a democratic society. You can't always tell, she admitted. That's why democratic oversight exists. Congressional committees with security clearances who can review classified operations and ensure they meet legal and ethical standards. That's why there are inspector generals and internal review processes. That's why operations are documented and preserved for eventual historical analysis. But none of that helps me right now, Peterson protested. I'm supposed to just trust that everything is legitimate because someone with a security clearance says so? You're supposed to trust the system of checks and balances that Americans have developed over centuries to ensure military accountability, Sarah replied. You're supposed to trust the oath that every military officer takes to support and defend the Constitution. And, yes, sometimes you're supposed to trust the people who volunteer to do dangerous work on your behalf. The conversation had evolved from Peterson's original lecture about special operations mythology into something more substantive, a discussion about civil-military relations, democratic oversight, and the balance between operational security and public accountability. Other patrons in the bar were listening with obvious interest. This wasn't the kind of conversation they expected to overhear on a Tuesday night, but it was certainly more engaging than typical bar discussions about sports or politics. I still don't understand why you look so normal, Peterson said, his tone now more curious than hostile. I always imagined special operations people would be more obvious somehow. Sarah almost laughed at that. And that's exactly why we're effective. If we looked like everyone's stereotype of a commando, we'd be pretty useless for most of our missions. The ability to blend in, to appear unremarkable, is one of our most important skills. She gestured around the bar. Take tonight, for example. I've been sitting here for 2 hours, and nobody suspected I was anything other than a civilian having a drink. That's not an accident. It's training and practice. The young sailor was still staring at her with obvious admiration. What's it like, being part of something like that? Sarah considered how to answer without violating operational security or giving away sensitive information. It's like being part of a very small, very close-knit family that happens to have one of the most dangerous jobs in the world. The training is harder than anything you can imagine. The stakes are always life and death, and the people you work with become closer than brothers and sisters. She paused, thinking about teammates who hadn't made it home from various missions over the years. It's also heartbreaking sometimes, and lonely, and harder on your personal relationships than most people realize. There's a reason the divorce rate is so high in special operations units. But you think it's worth it? Peterson asked, his earlier hostility replaced by what seemed like genuine curiosity. Every single day, Sarah replied without hesitation. Even on the worst days, even when things go wrong, even when the cost is higher than anyone wants to pay. Because the alternative, letting dangerous people carry out their plans unopposed, is unacceptable. She looked around the bar, making eye contact with several of the patrons who were listening. Everyone in this room tonight can sleep peacefully, Because there are people willing to do very dangerous work in very dangerous places to keep threats away from American soil. That work doesn't stop just because it's inconvenient or because it requires secrecy. The bartender had been quietly cleaning glasses throughout the conversation, but now he set down his towel and looked directly at Sarah. "Ma'am, I want to thank you for your service. And I want to apologize for the disrespectful comments you had to listen to earlier." "No apology necessary," Sarah replied. "Peterson has every right to his opinions, and honestly, some of his concerns about accountability and transparency are legitimate. The problem isn't that he asked hard questions, it's that he concluded the answers didn't matter." Peterson himself looked thoroughly chastened. The confident, lecturing petty officer who had dominated conversation for most of the evening had been replaced by someone who was clearly questioning everything he thought he knew about military service and special operations. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "Not just for the specific things I said about special operations, but for the attitude behind them. I was being disrespectful to people who deserve better." Sarah nodded acknowledgement of the apology, but didn't make a big show of accepting it. The important thing is understanding why those attitudes are problematic. It's not about my feelings or anyone else's. It's about recognizing the value of service and sacrifice, even when you can't see all the details. The storm outside was beginning to subside, and several patrons are checking their phones and preparing to leave. But the group around Sarah showed no signs of ending their conversation. This was clearly the most interesting discussion any of them had experienced in quite some time. As the evening progressed, the conversation in Murphy's bar took on an entirely different character. What had started as Peterson's one-sided lecture about the mythological nature of special operations had evolved into something more resembling a masterclass in military service, democratic institutions, and the complex relationships between warriors and the society they protect. Sarah found herself in an unexpected role as educator, answering questions not just from Peterson and his companions, but from other patrons who had been drawn into the discussion. The bartender had discreetly moved other customers away from the immediate area, creating an informal seminar space around the bar where Sarah sat. "Can I ask about the name?" the young sailor inquired. "Shadow 6, I mean. How do call signs work in your community?" Sarah smiled at the question. "Call signs usually come from something memorable about your personality, your background, or something that happened during training or early operations. They're not always flattering, and you don't get to choose your own." "So why Shadow 6? Peterson asked, his earlier hostility completely replaced by curiosity. The 6 part indicates a team leader position, its standard military designation. The shadow part. Sarah paused, considering how much to reveal. "Let's just say I had a talent for appearing and disappearing at opportune moments during training exercises." The explanation drew chuckles from her audience, but the young sailor pressed for more details. "I heard there was an operation where you infiltrated an enemy compound by yourself and extracted 3 hostages while the rest of your team was pinned down by enemy fire." Sarah's expression became more serious. "I can't discuss specific operations, but I can tell you that the stories usually get exaggerated in the telling. Special operations is a team effort. Nobody accomplishes anything significant by themselves. But some of the stories have to be based on real events," Peterson's companion with the Boston accent insisted. "I mean, Shadow 6 didn't become a legend by accident. The stories exist because people need heroes," Sarah replied carefully. "They take real events and real people and turn them into something larger than life. It's human nature to want to believe in exceptional individuals who can overcome impossible odds." She paused to take a sip of her whiskey before continuing. "The reality is that special operations succeeds because of extensive preparation, superior training, advanced equipment, excellent intelligence, and teams of professionals who trust each other completely. It's not about individual heroics. It's about systematic preparation and execution." The bartender had been listening intently, and now he spoke up. "That's what people don't understand about combat in general. The movies make it look like it's all about individual courage and split-second decisions, but the real professionals I knew were the ones who planned everything down to the smallest detail. Exactly right, Sarah agreed. Courage is important, but it's not enough by itself. You need skills, training, equipment, intelligence, and, most importantly, teammates you can rely on absolutely. A woman from the group that had entered earlier approached the informal gathering. "I hope you don't mind me listening," she said to Sarah. "My ex-husband was Army Special Forces, and he never talked about his work. It's interesting to hear someone actually discuss what that world is like." Sarah nodded sympathetically. "The secrecy is hard on families. Your husband probably wanted to share his experiences with you, but operational security requirements make that impossible. It's one of the biggest challenges of Special Operations Service. The isolation that comes from not being able to discuss your work with the people closest to you." "Is that why you're talking about it now?" the woman asked. "Because you're not active anymore?" "I'm currently on leave," Sarah clarified. "And I'm not discussing specific operations or current capabilities. I'm talking about general aspects of special operations culture and training that don't compromise anyone's safety." Peterson had been quietly listening to these exchanges, and now he raised a concern that had clearly been bothering him. "Earlier tonight, I said some pretty harsh things about special operations, people thinking they're better than regular military. Was I completely wrong about that?" Sarah considered the question seriously. It was a common perception, and she knew it had some basis in reality. "There can be an elitism problem in special operations communities," she admitted. "When you've gone through extremely difficult selection processes and advanced training, when you're given access to the best equipment and, most important, missions, it's easy to develop a superiority complex." She looked around at her audience to ensure they understood her point. "But the best special operations professionals remember that they're part of a larger military structure. A SEAL team can't operate without Navy ships to transport them. Army Special Forces can't function without Air Force planes to support them. Delta Force relies on regular Army logistics and intelligence." "So the attitude Peterson was complaining about is real?" the young sailor asked. "Sometimes," Sarah acknowledged. "And when it exists, it's counterproductive and unprofessional. Special operations units are force multipliers, not replacement forces. We work in small numbers precisely because we're supported by larger conventional forces." Peterson seemed relieved that his concerns weren't entirely misplaced. "So I wasn't crazy to think there was sometimes an arrogance problem?" "Not crazy at all," Sarah replied. "But the solution isn't to dismiss special operations as mythological. The solution is to ensure proper integration and mutual respect between special operations and conventional forces." The conversation had attracted the attention of most of the bar by this point. Even patrons who had been trying to maintain their own discussions were openly listening to the exchange. The bartender had stopped pretending to work and was clearly enjoying the impromptu educational session. "Can you tell us anything about the training?" asked one of Peterson's companions. "I mean, everyone knows it's supposed to be incredibly difficult, but what makes it so special?" Sarah thought carefully about how to answer without revealing sensitive information. "The physical requirements get most of the attention, but that's actually not the most important part. Physical fitness is a baseline requirement. If you can't meet the physical standards, you won't even be considered." She paused to organize her thoughts. "The real challenge is mental. Special operations training is designed to put you in situations where failure seems inevitable, where the easy choice is to quit, where continuing requires a level of determination that most people don't know they possess." "What kind of situations?" the woman whose ex-husband had been Special Forces asked. "Sleep deprivation, physical exhaustion, psychological pressure, impossible timelines, contradictory orders, simulated life or death scenarios," Sarah listed. "The instructors create conditions that push you beyond what you thought were your limits, then push you further." She smiled slightly at some private memory. "The goal isn't to teach you how to swim faster or run longer. It's to teach you that you can continue functioning effectively even when every instinct tells you to quit. That mental toughness is what special operations is really about." Peterson was listening with obvious fascination. "And people actually volunteer for this? Not only volunteer, but compete intensely for the opportunity, Sarah replied. The selection process for most special operations units has far more qualified applicants than available positions. But why? Peterson asked. Why put yourself through something that difficult and dangerous? Sarah considered how to explain something that she knew would be difficult for civilians to understand. Because there are threats in the world that require a response, and someone has to be prepared to provide that response. Because freedom and security don't maintain themselves. Because some people feel called to serve in the most demanding way possible. She looked directly at Peterson, and because despite all the difficulties and dangers, it's also the most rewarding work you can imagine. Being part of something larger than yourself. Working with the most dedicated professionals you'll ever meet. Knowing that your actions make a real difference in the world. There's nothing else like it. The young sailor had been taking in every word with obvious admiration. Do you miss it? When you're on leave like this, do you miss the action? Sarah laughed quietly. This conversation has been more action than I was planning for on my leave time. But yes, I miss aspects of it. I miss working with my team. I miss the sense of purpose. I miss the challenge of difficult problems that require creative solutions. What don't you miss? The bartender asked. The constant vigilance, Sarah replied without hesitation. The knowledge that a mistake could get you or your teammates killed. The weight of responsibility for other people's lives. The isolation from family and friends. The impossibility of explaining your work to people who care about you. She gestured around the bar. Conversations like this one, for example. This is the first time I've been able to discuss my work with civilians in any detail, and only because you happen to ask the right questions in the right circumstances. Peterson's expression had grown thoughtful. I think I understand now why you didn't correct me earlier. You're so used to not talking about your work that it probably felt natural to just listen instead of engaging. Partly that, Sarah agreed. But also because your opinions, even the ones I disagreed with, helped me understand how special operations is perceived by people outside the community. That's valuable information for someone in my position. The woman whose ex-husband had been Special Forces leaned forward with obvious interest. What do you mean? Special operations exist to serve the American people, Sarah explained. If significant portions of the population think we're mythological or elitist or unaccountable, then we need to understand why those perceptions exist and whether they're based on legitimate concerns. She looked at Peterson. Tonight helped me understand that at least some skepticism about special operations comes from a genuine concern about democratic oversight and transparency. That's a healthy concern in a free society, even if the conclusions drawn from it aren't always accurate. So you're not offended by criticism? Peterson asked, clearly surprised. Not when it's sincere and thoughtful criticism, Sarah replied. Democracy requires citizens who ask hard questions about their government and military. The problem tonight wasn't that you asked hard questions. It was that you had already decided the answers didn't matter. The storm outside had finally subsided, leaving only the gentle sound of rain droplets falling from the eaves. Several patrons had left during the conversation, but those who remained seemed reluctant to end what had become the most interesting evening any of them had experienced in quite some time. What happens now? The young sailor asked. I mean, when your leave is over? Sarah shrugged. I go back to work. There's always another mission, another training exercise, another problem that needs solving. And this conversation? Peterson asked. Does it change anything? Sarah considered the question seriously. It reminds me why we do this work. Conversations with American citizens, even difficult conversations like this one, help me remember what we're fighting to protect. She finished her whiskey and set the glass down on the bar. It also reminds me that the gap between the special operations community and the general public is probably larger than it should be. That's something worth thinking about. The bartender refilled her glass without being asked. One more for the road? Sarah smiled and accepted the drink. She had nowhere urgent to be, and this conversation had become far more meaningful than she had anticipated. Tomorrow she would return to a world of classified briefings and dangerous missions, but tonight she could simply be Sarah Martinez, sharing drinks and stories with fellow Americans in a warm bar on a rainy evening. The conversation was far from over, and there were still questions to be asked and answered. But already everyone present sensed that they had been part of something special, a rare moment of honest communication between worlds that usually remained separate and apart. The rain had stopped completely by the time Sarah finished her final whiskey of the evening. The storm that had trapped everyone in Murphy's bar had passed, leaving behind clean, cool air and the fresh scent that follows heavy rain. Through the windows, street lights reflected off wet pavement, creating an almost peaceful scene that contrasted sharply with the intensity of the conversation that had consumed the last several hours. The informal gathering around Sarah had grown to include nearly everyone remaining in the bar. Word had somehow spread that Shadow 6 was present and willing to discuss her experiences, and people had gravitated toward the conversation like moths to a flame. The bartender had given up any pretense of working and was now sitting on a stool, listening with the same rapt attention as his customers. Peterson sat directly across from Sarah, his entire demeanor transformed from the arrogant lecturer who had dominated the early evening. His companions flanked him, equally engaged in what had become a masterclass in military service and democratic values. The young sailor who had initially defended Special Operations Forces seemed vindicated by everything he had heard, while the others appeared to be processing fundamental changes in their understanding of military service. "I keep coming back to something you said earlier," Peterson said, his voice thoughtful and completely devoid of the hostility that had marked his earlier comments. "About trust being necessary when you can't verify everything independently. I think that's what I was really struggling with, the idea that I should trust institutions and people I can't evaluate for myself." Sarah nodded, understanding the deeper issue that had been driving Peterson's skepticism. It's a legitimate concern in a democracy. Citizens should be skeptical of unaccountable power, whether it's military, political, or economic. The question is how to maintain appropriate oversight without compromising necessary security. "But how do you balance that?" asked the woman whose ex-husband had served in special forces. "How do you ensure accountability when so much has to remain secret?" "Imperfectly," Sarah admitted with a wry smile. "Democracy is messy, and civil-military relations are especially complex. We've developed systems of congressional oversight, inspector generals, legal reviews, and chain-of-command accountability, but none of it is perfect." She paused, considering how to explain the complexity without revealing sensitive information. "The Real Safeguard is the oath that every military officer takes to support and defend the Constitution, not any individual or political party. That oath is taken seriously throughout the military, but especially in special operations where the potential for abuse is highest." "You really believe that?" Peterson asked. "That the oath is enough to prevent abuse?" "Not by itself," Sarah replied honestly. "But combined with training, institutional culture, legal frameworks, and oversight mechanisms, yes, I believe it works most of the time. When it doesn't work, we have systems to identify and correct problems." The bartender leaned forward with interest. "What happens when someone in special operations goes rogue or violates the law?" "The same thing that happens when anyone in the military violates the law. Investigation, court-martial, punishment," Sarah answered. "The difference is that special operations misconduct usually gets more attention because of the unit's high profiles and the sensitivity of their missions." She thought about several cases she was aware of where special operations personnel had been prosecuted for various offenses. The military justice system isn't perfect, but it takes violations seriously, especially when they involve special operations forces. Peterson had been listening intently, and now he raised a question that seemed to go to the heart of his earlier concerns. "But doesn't the secrecy make it easier to cover things up? If nobody knows what really happened on a mission, how can anyone be held accountable?" "That's why detailed documentation is so important," Sarah replied. "Every operation is recorded, reviewed, and preserved. Multiple people have access to that information, Not just the operators involved, but commanders, legal officers, intelligence analysts, and oversight officials. She gestured around the bar to include everyone in her explanation. The American people may not have immediate access to operational details, but their elected representatives do. Congressional oversight committees have security clearances and can review classified operations to ensure they meet legal and ethical standards. "And you trust that system?" the young sailor asked. "I have to," Sarah said simply. "If I didn't trust the system of democratic oversight, I couldn't do my job effectively." Part of being a professional military officer is accepting that civilian authorities have the right and responsibility to direct military action. The conversation had evolved far beyond Peterson's original lecture about special operations mythology. It had become a discussion about fundamental questions of democracy, accountability, and the social contract between military and civilian society. "I want to apologize again," Peterson said suddenly. "Not just for the things I said about special operations, but for the attitude behind them. I was being disrespectful to the whole concept of military service." Sarah shook her head. "You were asking hard questions that citizens should ask. The problem wasn't the questions. It was the assumption that if you couldn't verify the answers independently, they must be false." She looked directly at Peterson. "Your skepticism came from a good place, concern about accountability in a democratic society. That's healthy and necessary. But you took it too far when you concluded that unverifiable claims must be fictional. So what should I have done differently?" Peterson asked. "Ask the questions without prejudging the answers," Sarah replied. "Demanded accountability without assuming bad faith. Recognize that in a complex world, some things have to be taken on trust while still maintaining appropriate skepticism." The woman whose ex-husband had been special forces spoke up. "This whole conversation has helped me understand why my husband never talked about his work. It wasn't that he didn't trust me. It was that he couldn't discuss it without compromising operational security." "That's exactly right," Sarah confirmed. "The secrecy isn't about hiding from accountability. It's about protecting ongoing operations and future capabilities. But that secrecy comes at a personal cost for military families." "What's the hardest part?" the young sailor asked. "About maintaining that secrecy, I mean." Sarah thought about the question seriously. "The isolation. Not being able to share your experiences with people you care about. Having friends and family wonder what you really do for a living. Coming home from difficult missions and not being able to explain why you're different than when you left." She paused, remembering specific instances where the burden of secrecy had been particularly difficult. Also the knowledge that if something happens to you, your family may never know the details. They'll know you died serving your country, but they won't know the circumstances or why your sacrifice was necessary. The bar had grown quiet as patrons contemplated the weight of that sacrifice. These were concepts that most civilians never had to consider. The idea of serving in ways that couldn't be discussed, acknowledged, or even properly mourned. "Is it worth it?" Peterson asked quietly. Sarah didn't hesitate. "Yes, every single day, even when the cost is higher than anyone wants to pay. Because the alternative, letting dangerous people carry out their plans unopposed, is unacceptable." She looked around at the faces surrounding her, seeing genuine understanding where hours earlier there had been skepticism and dismissal. "The threats we face aren't going away. They're becoming more sophisticated, more dangerous, and more difficult to counter. Someone has to be prepared to meet those threats, and that someone is us." "But doesn't it change you?" the bartender asked. "Doing that kind of work for years?" "Of course it does," Sarah replied honestly. "You can't experience the things we experience and remain unchanged. You develop a different perspective on risk, on violence, on the fragility of the peace that most Americans take for granted." She considered how to explain something that was difficult even for military personnel to understand. "But you also develop an appreciation for the value of that peace, for the importance of protecting it, and for the privilege of serving something larger than yourself." Peterson had been listening with obvious fascination throughout this part of the conversation. I think I understand now why you didn't get angry when I was saying those things earlier. You've seen real threats, real violence, real consequences. My opinions probably seemed pretty trivial in comparison. Not trivial, Sarah corrected. Uninformed, but not trivial. The opinions of American citizens matter, even when they're based on incomplete information. Part of my job is serving people whether they understand what I do or not. She smiled at Peterson. Besides, your questions tonight help me think about important issues: democratic oversight, civil-military relations, the balance between security and accountability. Those are conversations worth having. The evening was winding down, and several patrons were beginning to make moves toward leaving. The intense focus that had characterized the conversation was giving way to a more relaxed atmosphere as people processed what they had heard. "What will you tell people?" Sarah asked the group. "About tonight, I mean. That's up to you." Peterson replied immediately. "If you'd prefer that this conversation stay private, I think everyone here would respect that." Sarah looked around at the assembled faces: Peterson and his companions, the young sailor, the woman whose ex-husband had served in special forces, the bartender, and several other patrons who had joined the discussion. All of them were nodding agreement with Peterson's statement. "I appreciate that," Sarah said, "but I think the conversation was valuable enough that it should be shared. Not the specific details about who was here or what unit I serve with, but the general themes about military service, democratic oversight, and the importance of asking hard questions while maintaining appropriate trust." She stood up from her bar stool for the first time in hours, stretching muscles that had grown stiff during the long conversation. "What I would ask is that you remember that special operations personnel are people doing a difficult job, not mythological figures or propaganda constructs. We deserve the same respect as any other military service members, but we don't deserve to be placed on pedestals or treated as superhuman." Peterson stood as well, extending his hand towards Sarah. "Thank you for your service, obviously, but also for taking the time to educate someone who really needed it." Sarah shook his hand firmly. "Thank you for being willing to listen and learn. That's more than many people would do when their fundamental assumptions are challenged." The young sailor approached next. "Ma'am, this has been the most incredible evening of my life. I feel like I understand military service in a completely different way now." "Good," Sarah replied. "But remember that understanding is just the beginning. The real value comes from applying that understanding in how you serve and how you interact with other service members." One by one, the other patrons approached to thank her for the conversation and to wish her well in her continued service. The woman whose ex-husband had been special forces was particularly emotional, saying that the evening had helped her understand her former marriage in ways she never had before. Finally, only Sarah and the bartender remained. He was cleaning glasses and preparing to close, but he seemed reluctant to end the evening. "That was something special," he said quietly. "I've been running this bar for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what happened here tonight." "Sometimes conversations take on a life of their own," Sarah replied. "I certainly didn't plan to spend my leave time conducting an impromptu seminar on special operations." The bartender smiled. "But I bet you don't regret it." Sarah considered that statement as she gathered her jacket and prepared to leave. The evening had been exhausting in its own way, requiring her to think carefully about every statement to avoid revealing classified information while still providing meaningful insights. But it had also been rewarding to bridge the gap between the special operations community and the civilian world, even in this small way. "No," she said finally, "I don't regret it at all. It reminded me why we do this work and helped me understand how we're perceived by the people we serve. That's valuable." She left money on the bar to cover her drinks and a generous tip, then headed toward the door. Outside, the storm had passed completely, leaving behind a clear night sky filled with stars that were rarely visible in the city. The air was cool and clean, carrying the promise of better weather to come. As she walked toward her car, Sarah reflected on the unexpected turn her evening had taken. She had come to Murphy's bar seeking anonymity and quiet relaxation. Instead, she had found herself in a position to educate fellow Americans about military service and democratic values. It wasn't how she had planned to spend her last night of leave, but it had been meaningful in ways she was still processing. Tomorrow, she would return to her unit and resume her duties as a Navy SEAL. The conversations about operational security, mission planning, and threat assessment would be conducted in secure facilities with classified briefings and advanced technology. But tonight's conversation in a simple bar had been just as important in its own way, a reminder of the connection between the military and the civilian society it serves. Peterson and his companions had learned something important about special operations forces and military service in general. But Sarah had learned something too, that the gap between the military and civilian communities could be bridged through honest conversation, mutual respect, and a shared commitment to democratic values. As she drove back to her hotel through the quiet streets of the city, Sarah Martinez, Shadow 6, carried with her the satisfaction of knowing that she had served her country as effectively with words in a bar as she had ever served it with actions on distant battlefields. Sometimes the most important missions were the ones that looked nothing like missions at all.